Hey, kijk eens.
As you can see, there are some announcements about the working groups. The outline is posted on Blackboard. I get a lot of questions from people who passed the working groups last year. Well, then you don't have to do the working groups this year because your grade will be valid for 1 year. So if you passed the working group last year, then you only have to do the exam. This week, the first session of the working groups are scheduled. If you have problems with enrollment, just go to the secretariat on the 5th floor, because I cannot solve those problems because I don't have any access to the USIS program, and they have. So you can go there and they can solve problems with the enrollment. Is that clear? Okay, let's start. Today we're going to talk about EU institutions, and I'm not going to talk about how many members the European Parliament has, what exactly the political parties are in the European Parliament. I'm not going into detail with regard to the Council, but what we are interested in here in this course is the interaction between the EU institutions. So we are building upon other courses in which already an introduction was given of the European institutions, and we are going to draw upon the insights of those courses and try to go beyond what you already know. So, EU institutions and their interactions. And today we are going to look at the interactions between the Council and the European Parliament. I will give some background with regard to those two institutions, but we'll especially focus on recent developments and the interactions. And next week, we are going to look at the European Commission and also the Court. Now, let's start with a quiz. So just write down 1 to 5, because I have 5 questions. And I mean, it's not for a grade, just a little bit for fun, to check what you know about the European Parliament, about the Council, about the interactions. And during the lecture, you will find out what the answers are. Yeah? Okay, first question. Just write down the answers, and then afterwards we will come back to the answers during the lecture. First question. When are the next elections for the European Parliament? Just note down the year. Second question. Through which procedure is the European Parliament mainly involved in the EU decision-making process? What is the name of this procedure? And the third question, what is the preparatory body of the Council of Ministers in which high-ranked civil servants prepare the meetings of the Council? See a lot of people not participating in the quiz, that's fine, but then you don't get any award. Then the fourth question, who is this? And he's a member of an EU institution, but which one? And then the last question, who is this? And he's also a member of an EU institution. Which one? And what is his role in this institution? And pay close attention during these 2 times 45 minutes, and then you will know the answers. I hope it was not too difficult. And these questions will not be the same as the questions on the exam, that's clear. Let's go what we're going to do today. First of all, I would like to just shortly elaborate on where we have to place the European Parliament and the Council in the whole system, the multi-level system of EU politics and policy. That's the first thing that we need to do. Then I'm going to say something about the Council, the competences, actors and composition, just very shortly. I also will do that on the European Parliament. And then we are going to focus on these interactions between the Council and the European Parliament, discuss recent developments, and if there's still time, also say something about the legitimacy of the European Parliament and the Council and the problems that those institutions encounter at the moment. Now, let's first start with positioning the Council and the European Parliament in this multi-level system. Well, multi-level, we have two levels, very much simplified. But if you have an EU level, on which you have all kinds of institutions that are active, of course they are linked to all kinds of institutions at the member state level, organizations, bodies that are necessary to govern a society. So we start with citizens who have influence via their vote on national parliaments. And national parliaments control the national government. And of course national governments are supported by public officials, civil servants. There are national courts, but and this is the first link to the EU level, we also have the European Court of Justice. And those courts are closely interlinked, as you will learn next week. Now the citizens also elect the European Parliament, and the European Parliament is then the only directly elected European institution, because all the other European institutions, like the Council of Ministers or the European Council, are not directly elected. The Council of Ministers gets all its members from the member states, from the national governments, as we will discuss. And also the European Council. There are only representatives of all the member states in this European Council, the heads of state and government. National ministries send civil servants to Brussels to prepare legislation. But then there's also a European Commission who proposes EU legislation to the member states. And for this decision-making process, it is especially important to take into account the interactions between, on the one hand, the European Commission, and on the other hand, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. And that's why these arrows, this triangle, European Commission, Council of Ministers and European Parliament, is important. This is very short how you can understand what the position is of the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, because that is what we are going to focus on today. Next week, as I already told you, the European Court of Justice and the European Commission will be the focus. And later on, when we are going to talk about the economic crisis and the reaction, or the lack of reaction of the European Union, we are much more going to focus on the European Council, which is not a topic that we are going to cover today extensively. So, some elements we are not going to discuss today. Also, the European Council will not really be on the agenda. National parliaments, well, we are going to say something about it, but not a lot. Really, interactions that we are going to discuss are these. We have actors at the member state level, national governments, national ministries, and citizens who send representatives to the EU level, citizens by directly electing the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers just consists of civil servants, but also ministers from the cabinet in the member state. Now, if we make a distinction of all the European institutions that are around, then very often this distinction is made, where you can see on the left-hand side the more intergovernmental institutions, which are the European Council and the Council of Ministers, because here are represented the heads of state and government of each member state, and in the Council of Ministers, a minister, and it can be on whatever policy field, social affairs, education, whatever, depending on which legislative proposal is discussed at the EU level. But the interests of the member states are organized in those two institutions, the European Council and the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is really the legislative backbone, whereas the European Council is much more responsible for the general direction of the EU. We look at the right-hand side, you can see supranational institutions, like the European Commission, which is some kind of the watchdog, so that all member states comply with the EU treaties, and also the European Parliament. Elections for the European Parliament are always on the basis, at least that's what the members of the European Parliament want, on European issues. They defend interests of citizens with regard to EU legislative proposals. It is on EU matters, and they are elected on the basis of a political program and their vision for Europe. Now, in reality, most of the time these elections are so-called second-order elections. So in the Netherlands, people vote for parliamentary elections for the European Parliament, but they really look at the government. Do they like what the government, the national government is doing nationally? And on that basis they decide what to vote for the European Parliament. So real EU issues are not at the core of those elections. But the European Parliament, elected after those elections, really only pushes for EU issues, so strongly supranational, just as this European Commission. You can also see some challenges on the slide. So if you look at the Council of Ministers and the European Council, the effectiveness at a time of crisis. In a couple of weeks we are going to discuss that with regard to the European Council. A lot of national interests, as we saw last week when the budget, the 7-year budget for the EU was agreed upon by the Council. We are going to discuss that later as well. And then all kinds of democratic discontent. People look at the European Council, see their head of state of government or state of government doing all kinds of things, and they don't agree. And at the same time, also these supranational institutions have a lot of problems. So the European Commission is slowly losing power, and more power is in the hands of the European Council, the more intergovernmental and member state-led institution. And, as we will see, there's a strong struggle between the European Parliament and the Council for power. The European Parliament always saying, we are the only directly elected institution, so we should have more power. Whereas the Council, they want to control what is happening, and they don't want to shift too much competences to the European Parliament. So there's clearly a struggle going on. And it seems now that the European Parliament is increasing its power. Now let's look at some of the basics of the working of the Council. And when I talk about the Council, I always talk about the Council of Ministers. So not the European Council, where the heads of state and government are organized, but I'm talking about the Council of Ministers, where all the sectoral ministers, depending on the policy field, are organized. So as I said, the Council of Ministers consists of ministers from the member state, and it has an executive function and is part of the EU's dual executive. The Council is the EU's main legislative body. So it deals with legislation. And you in the working groups are also going to deal with certain legislation. You are going to study a directive. And the implementation of a directive, an EU legislative proposal, and also adopted in an EU law, is going to implement it at the national level. But before it can be implemented, of course, it has to be negotiated. And the Council plays here a vital role in ensuring that the interest of each individual member state is guaranteed. Now, we always talk about the Council of Ministers, but actually that's not completely correct, because there are a lot of different sectoral councils, depending on which policy field the EU legislative proposal, which is negotiated, is in Parliament and is proposed by the European Commission. So legally it is one body, but in the course of European integration, more and more subdivisions of the Council of Ministers were developed. So in 1994 there were over 20 different councils. This was too fragmented, and they decided in 2002 in Sevilla to reduce those number and make it more coherent. If we look at the 9 councils that are now in existence, which organize and bring together the ministers of all member states on the specific policy field, you can see that there are large differences. The General Affairs and External Relations Council has a lot of meetings, almost once a month, whereas Education, Youth and Culture hardly has any meetings. Why do you think that is? What can explain these large differences in amount of meetings a year?
The topics that are important at the time of being discussed.
So the topics important at the time discussed. But if we listen, these are figures from 2009, but if I would look up the figures for last year, they would be exactly the same. 1 or 2 less, but they would be more or less the same. And maybe, yeah, yes.
I think general affairs is seen as a more important subject than education and culture.
Yeah, okay. So it's more important. And why do you think?
Well, I think it's the same in national governments. General affairs is the subjects discussed there are more subjects to discuss, and there are greater importance to the countries.
Okay, and education is not important?
Well, but I think it's more national subject, so it doesn't need to really be discussed in the council.
Okay, so education is a national subject, and there's no need to discuss because all competences are at the national level. So why would you discuss then education? Yeah, good point. Maybe other people?
Well, maybe it also has to do with the fact on how soon things change. Because the financial market is up there and it's off, and it needs a lot of attention. If you set out plans for education, let's say, it might take a few years, and there's no real need to meet every 2-3 weeks.
Okay, so maybe some kind of agenda which is more important and will take a long time.
The first one is more controversial, so it means that they couldn't reach an agreement in the current level, and certainly more time is spent in
Okay, so some of these things are more controversial, and the more controversial something is, the better it needs to be prepared, and the more meetings there are at the end. Well, the main reason is that if you look at these numbers, that for some there are a lot of competences at the EU level. So there is a lot of legislation at the EU level. An example is agriculture and fisheries. So the more legislation at the EU level, the more legislative proposals, and the more this council, sectoral council, needs to meet. So that is one reason, just a lot of EU competences, which also explains education, youth and culture, which is very national. Hardly anything happens there. They discuss Erasmus programs to send students abroad. They discuss how important innovation and education is, but they cannot really decide anything because there is no support among member states to have a real competence at the EU level. But if we look at external relations, there's no real competence at the EU level. They do some stuff, increasingly so with diplomatic missions. But here the Council is very powerful. So it's not just an EU level competence, it's the competence of the Council. And not a competence of the European Parliament that cannot do anything. So this can also be a reason, not just a general EU level competence, but a very specific competence of the Council. So there are several reasons why some sectoral councils of the ministers meet more often than others. And of course, this Economic and Financial Affairs Council is getting increasingly important and is also getting more and more media attention. Now, I said that nothing really changes in the amount of meetings through time if you have 2006 or 2011, but what does change is the role of the Council. And here we have to make a distinction between before the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty and after. And this Lisbon Treaty is often called as well the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And the treaty that was proposed in the referendum is often called the Constitutional Treaty, which was voted down, and then the Lisbon Treaty was written and in the end accepted in 2009. And if we look at the role of the Council, then we need to take into account this Lisbon Treaty, because here a lot of things have changed. I already said the European Parliament is getting more and more important. And in the Lisbon Treaty it was written down that the so-called co-decision procedure, which is the procedure that involves the European Parliament the most in the whole EU level decision-making process, would apply to almost all policy fields. So before Lisbon, the Council co-legislated with the European Parliament, but also had for 20% of the cases could legislate alone and could just ignore the European Parliament. This is now almost impossible because almost all policy dossiers need also to be agreed upon by the European Parliament. There are some exceptions, like foreign policy, as I said before, but most of them, well, there needs to be some kind of involvement of the European Parliament through this co-decision procedure. And since Lisbon, this is called the ordinary legislative procedure. So Lisbon is very important to take into account. If we look at the decision making in the Council, well, it all started with just unanimity. Every member state had a veto. Well, this didn't really work, so they said, well, if we would decide everything by unanimity all the time, then there would always be one member state, maybe a very small one, Luxembourg, that could block everything. And then we cannot really integrate. So that is not really a solution, so we should come up with something else. And this Something else is called qualified majority voting. And increasingly over the years you can see that unanimity in the Council on policy fields is replaced by this qualified majority voting. There are various rules, and we're going to look at some of those rules, what it means, this qualified majority voting. Most of the time it means some kind of supermajority. So it is not only half plus one, but a two-thirds majority that is needed. So unanimity is still in place for taxes, social policy, defense, foreign policy, treaty revisions, where member states can veto certain decisions and nothing can change if they don't change their veto. But on most policy fields, member states can be outvoted. It can even be part of a rather large minority, but still be outvoted. Now, for qualified majority voting, there are two other treaties important. First, we have Nice, and we have again Lisbon. Because what Nice did, the most stupid thing ever, was to make everything even more complex than it already was. So it was not only two-thirds of member states need to agree when a legislative proposal is discussed. No, they made it more complex. And they said, okay, we have votes and we assign votes to member states. And the bigger member states get more votes and smaller member states get less votes. And we start voting on a legislative proposal, and at least 255 votes need to be in favor. But next to that, also a majority of member states needs to be in favor. So you just count the number of member states as well. And then, thirdly, what is also needed to get a qualified majority decision is that the member states in favor of a decision needs to be at least 62% of the population. And you can imagine that it's not very easy in a whole decision-making process to determine what will happen beforehand. And you can also imagine that it's rather political if you start discussing among member states who gets 1 vote or 10 votes or 2 votes. So this is really hard bargaining between those member states. And a lot of member states are still a little bit angry at each other because of these Nice negotiations. So if you look at these voting weights, there was one member state very happy and one member state not so happy. The Netherlands was very, very proud that it had 1 vote more than Belgium, which was presented by the Netherlands at the time as the best thing that could happen for the Netherlands. And Belgium was very annoyed that the big neighbor again had more power, because previously this was not the case. Now they came up with all these voting weights. All the heads of state and government decided this at Nice. And one of the heads of government came out of the meeting room, saw some journalists, and directly said, I don't like this decision, and it is definitely on the table for future negotiations, which was Gerhard Schröder of Germany. Because he didn't like it that also the United Kingdom was up there, that could maybe also have a very strong blocking power here because of the large voting weights. Now, this very complex process of voting was indeed renegotiated in Lisbon and was somewhat simplified. And I explain this not that you learn by heart exactly how the Nice voting rules work, but I explain this to indicate that it's a highly political process how to decide in the Council. And even this system, the Lisbon Treaty system of a global majority voting system, is on the table to be renegotiated, and it's not fully in effect. So we have now at least 65% of the population and 55% of the member states that need to agree, and there can also be a blocking majority of at least 4 member states. So it's simplified, so we don't have all those voting weights anymore. But as a compromise, they said every member state can always go back to the Nice voting rules if it wants. So basically what we have now is a very complex Nice system and also a rather complex Lisbon system functioning next to each other. And the Nice system is going to be phased out, but at the same time member states can still go back if they want, and they are going back if they know that the Nice system is more favorable for them instead of the Lisbon system. So the ways to define what a qualified majority voting system is crucial for the power a member state has. And of course, Luxembourg realizes that it's not very strong, but it will, of course, if a proposal is on the table that gets a majority under the Lisbon system, has a strong interest to switch to the Nice system if it can push forward its own interests. So, highly political within the Council. How does the Council work? We now only discuss basically the top of the pyramid, the ministers who are getting together in Brussels and discuss highly political issues. But most of the issues don't arrive at the table of the ministers at the top of the pyramid. And that is because there are all kinds of preparatory bodies within the Council that prepare the agenda of the Council of Ministers. So if there's a very important directive with regard to the registration of chemicals, so that safety can be ensured, and that the Italian industry has to deal with chemicals in the same way as the Dutch ones, this is highly political, and of course is going to be discussed in the top among the ministers. But then there are also a lot of other things that are not very important at face value. One example is all kinds of legislation with regard to agricultural equipment, that agricultural vehicles need to have rear mirrors. There's a lot of legislation in the European Union that is just highly technical and not very important. Now for these things, there are working parties of national civil servants coming together in Brussels who are discussing these highly technical issues and prevent that the ministers need to discuss these technical issues. So only the issues that end up here are highly political, but a lot of issues are just dealt with by civil servants of national ministries. So these working parties at a much lower level are very, very busy in dealing with all kinds of EU legislation. And only when these civil servants of each individual member state together in Brussels cannot agree, it goes up one level. And here the COREPER, which is another body within the Council, also with national representatives, but now higher ranked civil servants, they discuss all the things that the working parties of civil servants couldn't agree upon. So it moves up one level in the pyramid. And also here a lot of issues are just off the table, that are not needed to discuss anymore, because there is agreement between all civil servants in each member state. But sometimes it is just not possible. I already referred to this chemical directive, also called REACH. And in this directive it was impossible, because it was so complex, it needed to be prepared by the working parties. All the problems they need to make an inventory of all the problems with this legislation, and the problems with national legislation that didn't fit but they couldn't agree on anything because it was too big. There were too many interests involved. So it went up one level to the co-repair, they discussed it, they couldn't agree, and then it went up to the ministers. And they needed to decide, with qualified majority voting, what would happen. But then at least the elected ministers, or at least the cabinet representatives of each member state, decides on this highly political issue what is happening. So there's a clear hierarchy, taking into account that some legislation is highly technical and just does not need to be on the table to be decided by these ministers. Is it clear for everyone? Questions, maybe? Okay, so now you already have a couple of answers on the quiz. Let's continue with another question. Who is the person on the right? And of which subgroup of the Council of Ministers is he the chairperson? Anyone knows? Yeah. Okay, so we have Dijsselbloem. If we go back to the list, then he would be in the Economic and Financial Affairs, you would say? Okay. Everyone agrees? Indeed, Dijsselbloem, Minister of Finance, Dutch Minister of Finance, but as well chair, and the person next to him is Juncker, the former chair of this group. And you would indeed say, well, we talked about the Council, and he's a Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs, they get together, sometimes it's only one representative, sometimes two, as in the Netherlands, because there are two ministers dealing with all kinds of economic affairs. Dijsselbloem goes there once a month, but he's actually not part of, strictly speaking, the Council of Ministers. Because what he does is being a chair, more technical chair, so he's not influencing the agenda heavily of the Eurogroup. So the Economic and Financial Affairs Council organizes all member states, whereas the Eurogroup gathers after the Economic and Financial Affairs Council, but then they ask some countries to leave the meeting, like the UK, Sweden and Denmark. And they cannot be present because they discuss Euro issues. And he was appointed the chair of this Eurogroup, a very important group. He was appointed because he's a social democrat. France liked that, because there's a social democratic government. And Germany liked it because he is clearly in line with what Germany thinks is good economic and financial policy. So he was an ideal compromise candidate of a country that also has a AAA status economically still. Maybe we're going to lose it, but at that time was no doubt with regard to the AAA status of the Netherlands. So an ideal candidate. Well, the guy here, he's from Luxembourg, so you can already guess a little bit that that they don't want to have a person from France or from Germany, because they could easily just be some kind of spokesperson of the interest of Germany. So they want to have a person from a smaller country that doesn't have this weight of politicians from bigger member states. And this Eurogroup gets more and more important. It's the group of finance ministers of EU member states that are also member of the Eurozone. And also here we have working parties, in the same way as we have in the normal Council of Ministers, but this is just a more restricted set of ministers that are gathering here. So it is not as straightforward, and it's getting increasingly complex, because we have on the one hand the Eurozone group, but all the rescue packages with regard to Greece and also the large funds that are now put together are decided upon yet a bigger group. So the UK doesn't participate there, but Denmark and Sweden do. So we just get some kind of patchwork of all kinds of council formations where some member states do participate and others don't. And it's not really coherent. And this is a rather recent development where all kinds of groups of ministers are meeting all the time, and some ministers need to leave the room because they are not a member. Now another problem in the Council is that there's a lot of fragmentation. So there are 27 member states. The number of member states is probably increasing in the future. There are a lot of interests, and it's very difficult to get all those interests in line with each other. So what you need is some kind of coordinating mechanism. And of course you have national mechanisms of coordination, where civil servants in The Hague come together and meet and prepare the agenda of the Council meeting in Brussels, or the Working Party meeting in Brussels. That helps. You have the European Council, where all the heads of state and government are organized in, and they also try to prevent that all these national interests in the Council of Ministers are clashing all the time. You have the Coreper, which are these high-ranked civil servants that can prepare the meetings of the Council of Ministers and maybe can already try to get rid of the fiercest political conflict. And we have something like the presidency, which switches every 6 months. It is not as important as it was before, but still, every 6 months a new member state is in the presidency. And also this presidency, this member state, can then influence the agenda a bit and try to lobby among all the different member states to get agreement on a proposal. Because someone is now getting cold and it's time for a break. After the break we are going to discuss the European Parliament very shortly, the competences of the Parliament. Because of time I'm not going to show you these videos, but they are a rather nice introduction. Two sides of the story. One, very, very enthusiastic about the European Parliament. A member of the European Parliament introducing the European Parliament. And the second one, a member of the European Parliament from the UK, who's criticizing the work of the European Parliament. I will put these slides on Blackboard so that you can look up the video clips. But let's focus on the interactions between the Council and the European Parliament. Now, one of the powers of the European Parliament is approving the budget of the European Union. And every 7 years, a budget needs to be approved. It's a lot of money, not if you compare it to the entire GDP of all member states together, but there are some harsh negotiations going on. And last week, agreement was reached between all member states in the European Council. Maybe you heard something about it. Or if not, then I have here a couple of websites where talks and discussions were going on what was happening. Before, a lot of member states were saying, we need more money, we need more subsidies. Whereas other member states, like Germany, said, no, we need to cut spending. all member states, all governments need to cut spending because it's economic crisis, and also the EU should do that. So then, all of a sudden, all the civil servants in Brussels were angry because they had to maybe accept lower salaries. They wanted to go on strike. But these strikes and the threat to go on strike all can more or less be related to these budget talks. So 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a lot of heads of state and government started to pop up in the media and saying, we want this and we want this. Now, there was a breakthrough and there is now a deal, but directly all kinds of criticism was voiced. Also in the UK, so this is an article of The Guardian that says that, well, maybe there are some cuts in spending in this budget, but if you are really going to look in detail, the only thing that the heads of state and government did were just to get some easy victories that they can sell to their domestic publics, but no problems are solved. And there's no money for stimulating economic growth. There's no money to fight youth unemployment. There's no money for innovation, like on the blog of Nelly Kroes, saying that of course she's going to do whatever she needs to do to promote the digital agenda as European Commissioner, but it's going to be very, very difficult because the heads of state and government decided to put no money whatsoever in promoting broadband internet and high-speed internet, ADSL, and all other kinds of technologies to develop them further. So she has a problem right now. She doesn't have any money to spend on innovation, technology, and the digital agenda. Now, what we also see, and this is a first example of this interaction between the European Parliament and the Council, is that all kinds of members of the European Parliament, like Martin Schulz, who is the chair of the European Parliament, saying, well, it's all nice that the Council of Ministers and the European Council agreed on a budget, but we can say yes or no to this budget. So why didn't you talk to us before you reached an agreement? Because now you don't know if we like it or not as MEPs. And he already warned before the budget talks were ending that the EU Parliament would not agree, and that he estimated that there would be a lot of opposition. So Guy Verhofstadt, one of the members of the European Parliament, a Belgian former Prime Minister, also leader of a very strong pro-European political party in the European Parliament, the Liberals, he states, we are not going to agree with this budget. It is not addressing the main problems of the European Union, and we need more money as a European Union because we are the institution that can solve the economic crisis. I mean, those are his words, not my words. And he's really, really pro-European and sees the European project not only as an ideal, but also as a way to solve all kinds of economic problems. And what is now happening in the European Parliament, they have to vote, they have to say yes or no to this budget deal, and all kinds of EU leaders who struck this deal a couple of days ago get a little bit nervous because they didn't talk to all those MEPs, to all those members of the European Parliament, but they do need the agreement of the European Parliament. So now, this week, a lot of lobbies will be set up and a lot of talks are going on between representatives of the Council, the European Council, and also sectoral councils, Council of Ministers on the one hand, and members of the European Parliament on the other. And it seems that in the European Parliament there is now going to be a secret vote. So you can either have a vote where everyone sees what a person is voting, or you can have a secret vote. And if you have a secret vote, it becomes much easier to vote against a proposal because no one knows. So now the risks are really high that this whole budget deal is maybe voted down. By changing a decision-making rule from public to secret vote, but also by the decision of the ministers in the European Council not to discuss anything with the European Parliament before there is a deal between member states. And they really couldn't because it was really complex to strike a deal. But here you can clearly see with regard to the budget, although it is only once every 6-7 years, that there is interaction between the Council and the European Parliament. And that they are linked to each other. So it is unclear at the moment what is going to happen, but it's highly political. And there are some serious clashes going on right now between pro-European institutions like the European Parliament and institutions, also EU institutions, which are much more intergovernmental, where the interests of the member states are much more at the forefront, like the European Council and the Council of Ministers. So the first task, approving the budget, is a very important way how the European Parliament can influence and also interacts with the European Council and the Council of Ministers. They can approve the Commission as a whole, something that is going to be discussed next week. But what I would like to focus on is the second, or the third point here, the so-called legislative function. Because here you can see most clearly how the European Parliament is in a continuous fight with the Council of Ministers. Where you can see that the European Parliament is defending the EU interests, the supranational interests, aiming for more European integration in most cases. Whereas the Council of Ministers is trying to defend the national interest and at the same time tries to solve all kinds of problems that cannot be solved by only national policy. And increasingly, as I already said, legislative proposals for EU legislation and laws are dealt with via the co-decision procedure, or labeled since Lisbon as the ordinary legislative procedure. And these other two are not that relevant anymore. So the assent procedure is only relevant now for enlargements. And that's about it. So let's look at this co-decision procedure. I'm not going to ask you to learn by heart exactly how this procedure works, but I want to show how the dynamics work between the two institutions and what the consequences are of those dynamics. So now we are really ending up in the topic interactions between Council and EP in the ordinary legislative procedure. Now what is this procedure exactly? It all starts with the Commission having the right of initiative. They propose legislation, and we're going to look at some examples of legislation. The Council then reacts, and the Parliament has the possibility to either amend the proposal of the Council, which is then already something different than the Commission initially proposed, or reject the proposal of the Council. And there are various steps in this whole procedure to ensure that all institutions can play a role and that no one is dominant over the others. So there are member state interests that need to be balanced with the supranational interest, and neither of the two institutions can get their way. Both the Council and the European Parliament are needed for legislation to pass at the EU level. So there's a whole procedure with all kinds of little steps that need to be taken to, in the end, arrive at a decision that is not dominated by either one of the institutions. And we, of course, need to take into account that there are different kinds of regulation or different kinds of EU law. There are directives, regulations. Regulations rather technical, much easier, directly applicable as law in each member state. And directives is also going to be the topic of the working groups, which is special EU legislation, where all the details are filled in at the member state level. So there are some guidelines that everyone agrees, But how exactly these guidelines need to be respected is all the member states can decide themselves. So the environment needs to be protected. You, as an industry, cannot pollute the air. There are certain standards with regard to air quality. These standards are set at the EU level, but how these standards are reached is up to each member state. So maybe they want to have all kinds of laws, new laws to reach that target which is set at the EU level, but the European Union does not specify how this target needs to be reached by each member state, but just controls the extent to which this target is respected. So some member states do not need to do anything because they already comply with the target, whereas the Netherlands has a lot of problems because we have a rather bad air quality here. And we do not comply with that EU legislation. We need to do a lot to fulfill that requirement. So in the Netherlands, new laws need to be introduced to fight pollution, whereas in other countries, there's no necessity because the standards, EU standards, are already fulfilled. So it really depends on the legislation, whether you need in a directive real national legislation to be implemented. Now this directive, I already said that is really going to be the focus of those working groups. But it's important to know the distinction. And both of them can be treated under the ordinary legislative procedure with this strong involvement of the European Parliament. If we look at all kinds of examples of EU legislation, I already said something about air quality, but you can also see here that there are all other kinds of examples of EU legislation, most of the time related with environment or the internal market in some kind of way. So the internal market for services, also known under the name Bolkestein directive. It was the commissioner who proposed that, so that someone from Poland can also work in the Netherlands easily, without all kinds of hassle of laws and these kind of things, and under the same conditions as the Dutch can also do. Industrial emissions, already talked about that. Air quality, waste, internal market for postal services, illegally staying third country nationals. So migration is also definitely a topic which is dealt with under the ordinary legislative procedure. Data retention directive, maybe I'm going to say something about that later. But you can see all kinds of directives where you can identify some kind of cross-border issue. Migration, environmental protection. A river with a lot of waste dumped by industries is not going to stop at the border, but just wants to go to the sea. So the Netherlands has a lot of problems because of industry in Germany. And this needs to be taken care of at the European level, otherwise you cannot coordinate this. So all these examples have some kind of cross-border component in there. Now there are several phases, and they are also explained in the book. What we are really focusing on is this second one, this EU-level decision-making process, whereas in the third phase, the working groups are in detail going to look at the implementation at the national level of directives. So now we are going to focus at the second phase of the ordinary legislative procedure, the EU-level decision-making process. It starts all with a proposal by the European Commission. And as I said, the European Council and the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament can react to that. And it is sometimes possible that they think, well, the proposal by the European Commission is not that bad. We as members of the European Parliament, we more or less agree, and we don't want a lot of changes. And also the Council thinks, well, this is all fine, and we need legislation to protect the environment. There are certain standards. All member states more or less can comply with those standards. Let's accept the proposal. And then you can have that legislation is adopted in so-called first reading. And a lot of times, rather technical issues, technical policy dossiers, are adopted in first reading, rather fast, within a year. Well, most of the time, it goes on. Because, of course, there are high stakes, high political stakes, and the European Parliament doesn't agree with the Commission proposal, makes a lot of amendments. The Council, where all the ministers are organized, they don't agree with the proposal. It goes through working parties, Coreper, the ministers are then voting, they just don't agree. Well, then it's a need for a second reading in the European Parliament. The European Parliament looks again at the proposal. A new amended proposal on the basis of the amendments of the Council, the amendments of the European Parliament in first reading. And most of the time, these discussions take place in committees, where specialists, so members of the European Parliament, look at the legislation which is proposed. And also here we can see sometimes that the European Parliament just agrees with the amendments by the Council and legislation is adopted. When they don't agree, it goes to the European Commission, who then gives an opinion, what they think about the amendments, and then it goes to second reading in the Council. Now we are most of the time around 2 years from the initial proposal by the Commission. Already takes 2 years. When the Council agrees, legislation is adopted. But very often it is not adopted and it goes in third reading, where representatives of the Commission, the European Parliament, the Council come together and try to strike a deal. Now if we end up over here, it takes 3 or 4 years after the initial proposal by the Commission to be able to strike some kind of deal. Very long, costs a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of energy. And in all those different readings, it is possible that lobby organizations are trying to influence MEPs or member states. So it's very cumbersome to arrive at this third reading. Again, when they have some kind of deal, this has to be proposed to the EP and the Council, and there needs to be a vote in the Council and a vote in the EP, and then legislation is adopted. But sometimes it isn't. And then it goes back to the European Commission, and the Commission needs to do a new proposal, and this can sometimes take 5, 6, 7 years. So you can either have very fast adoption in first reading, but very often you can see that it runs through the whole co-decision procedure. So it is long, it is complex. What do you think that happens? If you have 80 proposals a year that you need to look at as European Parliament and Council, what do you do? What do you think? Okay, a lot of talking, yeah? But if you keep on talking, you end up somewhere over there, and that can take 5, 6 years, and there's no legislation, postponements, and a lot of problems. Yes? Sorry?
The effects are too old. For example, when you have an economic crisis and you want to spend money, with time you do spend money, you cannot
Sorry?
it's also not relevant. They cannot be fast.
Yeah. Okay, so my question was, what are members of the European Parliament and the Council doing when they are confronted with this long, complex, cumbersome process?
Maybe the European Commission already communicates with the European Parliament and the Council to give them chances that the proposal will come through.
Yeah, good point. So we have the Commission who is already trying to somehow see what the European Parliament wants and what the Council wants, so that they can come up with a proposal that they know is going to be agreed upon. Well, that happens very often and they do that all the time. But these proposals are sometimes very complex and they cannot estimate perfectly what the European Parliament is going to think or what the Council is going to think. And you also have to take into account that this Council and the constellation in the Council changes all the time. Because it's dependent on national elections. So when Social Democrats are voted out of office, then all of a sudden you can have a lot of conservative governments in there. And sometimes you can have Social Democrats in there. So it changes. This also comes for the European Parliament every year, every period of years. So the Commission is very smart and has a lot of experts and they try to do that indeed. But they don't have complete information about all the preferences of the European Parliament and the Council. Okay, so we have one point, the Commission is looking at the preferences of the European Parliament and the Council. Other ideas? Lots of talking.
They have tried to find an agreement for the first reading.
Okay, so there are trialogues. Can you explain what a trialogue is?
It's a meeting of rapporteur, so the meetings committee, and with people of the council, people of the commission, and it's after that the draft report has been discussed in the plenary, just like a practical agreement to avoid to be on the second reading stage, which will require.
Yeah, very good. So what we have is, on the one hand, the European Commission preempting all kinds of conflicts, but we also have talks informally, so-called trialogue meetings, between the European Parliament members, the Council members, and some members of the Commission. And they especially take place in this first reading. So important members of the European Parliament, important representatives of the Council of Ministers meet behind closed doors, informally, to strike a deal in a very early phase of the co-decision procedure. Because you don't want to end up here, because this takes years and years and years. So you try to informally strike a deal. You could also call that in Dutch achterkamertjespolitiek. Not very transparent. But it's a way to deal with this very long and complex process. Now let's look a little bit more in detail what happens in the European Parliament and also with regard to those trialogues. Those informal meetings between the Council and the European Parliament. So here you see a graph with the various periods of sessions of the European Parliament. And you can see in a period in which it was not yet possible to agree in first reading that there was a lot of third reading and a lot of second reading. From 1990 onwards, it was possible to agree in first reading. And you can directly see that there was a sharp increase. And right now, almost everything is first reading. And these first readings can only be negotiated behind closed doors in a very early stage, where representatives of the Council and the EP meet and say, well, we give you something, and then we get something back, and we will propose it to plenary, but don't worry, they will all agree, and that's it. So no open debate, not very transparent, but highly efficient, because the amount of legislation adopted went up. And the amount of third readings, this very, very long process, went down. So you could say it's efficient, it's effective, there's more legislation adopted. So say maybe more problem solved in societies. And at the same time, more informal negotiations in a very early stage of the co-decision procedure, well, that doesn't really increase transparency, because there's this very small set of representatives of the institutions that are negotiating and striking deals all behind closed doors. So this was highly criticized by especially scholars, academics, who said, well, this is not the way how you deal with all these new powers that you give to the European Parliament. You give more power, and the reaction is less transparent decision making to deal with the increase in powers. Now, if you talk with a member of the European Parliament, most of them, and now it's a little bit changing, but most of them, they don't see the problem. They say, well, we can say and we can still vote in favor or against. We are involved. The Council takes us very seriously, and we get more legislation. You could, as a scholar, you could say, as an academic, that's true. Of course the European Parliament is involved, but it's not proposed to the plenary. There is no full parliamentary discussion anymore. It's behind closed doors. It's not really clear what is happening there. So there are really two arguments, some in favor and some against. And these arguments are used by different groups, people who study the European Parliament, and also people who are really participating in the daily decision-making process. Now, there are some examples where it had a rather negative effect. And one of those examples, and this is actually the most extreme example, was the Data Retention Directive from 2005. And this Data Retention Directive wanted to ensure that all providers of internet services would preserve the data of internet traffic of their customers. And in some countries this was 2 months, in other countries this was 3 years, which created all kinds of problems of competitiveness of those internet providers who had then difficulty to enter other markets. So there was a need for EU legislation. But it was also very politically sensitive because of the privacy of citizens and the cost for industry. And at the same time we had the bombings in London, and we had the presidency of the UK, of the Council, that really wanted to show some results. So there was an incredibly fast decision-making process. Within 6 months, the Member States, the European Parliament, and the Commission decided what would happen with this privacy legislation. And they said, well, you can just have a certain amount of time that you need to preserve the data, and the industry has to pay. The European Parliament agreed, the Member States agreed, because there was a lot of pressure to show results in the fight against terrorism. And because of the possibility to arrive at a decision in first reading, through these informal negotiations, you had policy, highly sensitive, highly political, within 6 months. And all kinds of problems emerged afterwards, because there were a lot of costs for internet providers, and it was not clear for them exactly what this all meant, all this legislation which was drafted very, very fast. And it was against a lot of constitutions in the Member States, because it was touching upon the privacy of citizens. So in Ireland, Slovakia, also in Germany, there were court cases saying that this legislation is completely in tension with all kinds of constitutional treaties at the national level. So on the one hand, it is extremely efficient and you can show results to the population with regard to the fight against terrorism, and on the other hand, you create legislation which is just sloppy, because there's not enough debate and not enough experts were consulted to arrive at proper legislation. Now, Maybe it is an extreme case, but here you can see all the dynamics and all the problems that are related with those informal agreements. I wrote an article myself on this, why is fast track, which means these early agreements, trialogues, the way to go, in which I researched the justifications given by European parliamentarians to go for this fast track legislation. So if you want to know more, you can read this article. But there are more developments. We now focused on this recent development because of the cumbersome process of the ordinary legislative procedure, but we also need to take into account the Lisbon Treaty. So the Lisbon Treaty gave much more powers to the European Parliament. There's an extension of the ordinary legislative procedure. They can now say much more on justice and home affairs. All kinds of international agreements. The EU can negotiate international agreements for all its member states. And before, the European Parliament did not have a say. Well, right now it has. And it can even block these agreements. And it did recently with an anti-piracy internet treaty between the US and the European Union. So here you can see that it clearly uses its powers given by the Lisbon Treaty. But at the same time, this Lisbon Treaty gave so much powers to the European Parliament that it cannot really cope with the increased workload. So there's more work for the European Parliament. And what do? They engage in more informal meetings in first reading between the Council and the European Parliament to deal with this increased workload. So you give more power to the only directly elected institution, and you end up with more informal agreements and less transparent decision making. Highly problematic from a democratic viewpoint, and also sometimes problematic from the viewpoint of efficient, effective policies. Okay, some shameless self-promotion again. There is one Dutch article, het Europees Parlement meer macht maar weinig zichtbaar, in which I explain exactly this argument, where you have more workload for the European Parliament, more democratic powers for the European Parliament, but you end up with a less transparent decision-making process. And this is actually quite relevant also if we take into account the role of national parliaments. Because if you have all kinds of informal agreements at the EU level, behind closed doors, you can imagine that representatives at the national level in national parliaments, they don't get that. It's not visible for them. And it passes unnoticed. So not only are at the EU level all kinds of parliamentarians of the European Parliament excluded from decision-making processes, but this also happens at the national level, where national parliaments cannot really follow what is happening in this very intransparent EU-level decision-making process. So it's a double problem for the democratic legitimacy of the EU multi-level system. Now let's look in the last 10 minutes to the problems that the European Parliament and the Council have in the eyes of citizens, because both institutions have a lot of problems. If we look first at the Council, we already talked about fragmentation, workload, all kinds of ways to deal with this. The last point here, all these early agreements, trialogues with the European Parliament. The Council needs to deal with this, and they also decide to engage in informal talks with the European Parliament, with all the negative consequences for the transparency of the decision-making process. And then there's also this threat of the European Council, where large states are very powerful. Well, the Council is less visible than the European Parliament. The European Parliament needs to be elected every 4 years, so here we can see also a lot of problems. So if you look at these two graphs, where you can see on the one hand the turnout, and also here the turnout in the 2009 European elections, we will have new elections in 2014. What is most remarkable here in these two graphs? So we have former Warsaw Pact member states who don't vote a lot. Slovakia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovenia. Then we have the UK. They don't vote a lot. Yeah, true. Other things? Why is Belgium and Luxembourg so high? Sorry? Okay, they have to vote, yeah, compulsory to vote. The Netherlands is up there, not very impressive. What does this mean for the legitimacy of the European Parliament? Every time with every new treaty provision they say we need more powers because we are the only democratic elected institution. Is this a valid argument?
I think it's the most democratic institution.
Okay, it is the most, yeah.
And maybe if it gets more power and becomes more important, people will vote more.
Okay, so just give more power and then in the end it will work out. Well, if we look here, the power of the EP increased and the turnout only went down.
Yeah, but maybe because media attention went down for the parliament and for the majority in general, and people became more cynical about it. Maybe it became more democratic, people became more positive about European Union and more interested.
Okay. So media is here an important factor. That maybe less media attention or pessimistic media attention can explain this. Well, I don't have graphs here with media attention. I also have them, and then you can see that the media attention for the European Parliament actually increases over the years. What would be a good hypothesis to do research on? What does it mean more for the European Parliament? Is this argument of them that they want more power still valid if you look at these figures? Well, it would be interesting to see what happens in 2014, especially in countries that are rather positive about the EU, like Italy. Where if you ask Italians, at least before the economic crisis, who do you trust, your national government or the European Commission, they would all say the European Commission because they don't trust their own government. But if you would ask them right now, it is rather different because the European Union forced the Italians to cut spending. So there you can see a lot of changes, and maybe this will result in that they will not show up in these elections. Or they do, but maybe will vote for anti-EU integration parties, which is of course also possible. Turning out in these elections doesn't mean that you are always positive about the EU, but you can also vote for political parties who don't really like the European Union and the European integration. Now it is stated by various scholars that you can only solve this problem with the turnout going down if you introduce real politics in the European Parliament. So Simon Hicks says if you don't have an opposition between left and right in the European Parliament and between pro and anti-EU in the European Parliament, people will never notice what is happening there. So you need these very strong divisions between political groupings. And right now, there is a left-right divide, but there's no strong pro-anti-EU divide in the European Parliament. The pro-EU group is much larger. So no political debates, not very visible, no political conflict whatsoever, only on very specific topics. And this is just not interesting. Not interesting for the media. Not interesting for citizens to follow. And that's why you can only see a downward trend in turnout. And there are actually already discussions going on, saying to members of the European Parliament, the next time we are going to revise a treaty, don't start again with the argument we are the only democratically elected institution, because actually the turnout EU-wide is below 50%. And in some countries it's even below 20%. And there are other issues with the European Parliament. It still lacks the powers of other parliaments. It doesn't have the right of initiative of legislation. This is only in the hands of the European Commission. And all those political parties that I was talking about are not really coherent, strong political parties. The Liberals are organized in a more or less cohesive party, but the D66 is in the same party as the VVD. And they have completely different visions for Europe at the national level. But they're still in the same political grouping, and there are more of these quite strange groups together. And it's a decision by the VVD and D66 to join those groupings. But if they do not join a big group, then they don't have any power in the parliament. So there's a strong incentive to just form these big groups that are rather incoherent. So they are not really transnational parties, and we still vote on national lists in the parliamentary elections. And then there's of course the big problem with Brussels and Strasbourg. Every time the sessions of the European Parliament take place in Brussels or in Strasbourg. It costs a lot of money to transfer every other week to either one city, and this is still blocked by France that doesn't want to give up the right to have these meetings in Strasbourg. And they can veto it, and they do every time it is on the table. Now hopefully it is a little bit clear how the interactions work between the European Parliament and the Council. Next week we are going to talk about the Commission and the National Court and the European Court of Justice.